So what we are going to discuss, is that what is the practice of our panelists in relation to the issues that have been presented today, and how they think their practice is going to change based on what has been presented pertaining to uterine cancers. So the first paper, as you all saw, was discussing the impact of body mass index on surgical costs and morbidity for women with endometrial cancer and hyperplasia. What I would like to ask the panelists is that do they find a changing trend in the incidence of endometrial cancer in our country? Dr. Shalini, would like to take that? Can we have some more mics, please?
Yes, it is increasing. In fact, it's become double of what it was in the last cancer registry, was 2.2 per 100,000, which was the lowest amongst the gynecological cancers. But the latest cancer registry results, it's doubled. It's about 4.2 to 4.3 per 100,000. So definitely it is increasing. We are seeing many more obese women. We are seeing many more endometrial cancers. Definitely. Is
this a reflection on the fact that the country is transforming from a calorie-starved to a calorie-rich country?
Absolutely, I think so.
I think that's the good part about the development that is happening in the country is translating into a slightly, the price that we have to pay for that is a slightly increased incidence of endometrial cancer. Does everybody agree that there is a, yes. So all the panelists seem to agree that there is an increasing trend of seeing more and more endometrial cancers in our country.
Also in practice, we are seeing more younger and younger females.
That is not pertinent. Yeah, I think that's a very pertinent point that Dr. Prashant has brought out, that we are tending to see more and more of younger women with endometrial cancers. And that has far-reaching implications on the practice or on the management of these patients, because a number of them may not have completed their family as yet. And that, once again, do you think is a reflection of the improving nutritional status of the country as such?
Social lifestyle.
Lifestyle, yeah. So there is, there are.
And PCOS also.
PCOS.
Because of the obesity. PCOS.
Well, they say India is the diabetes capital of the world, and that is what is translating into insulin resistance was always there in the country, but it's just that insulin resistance tends to manifest itself much faster when the weight gain occurs. And why probably PCOS is becoming more common is that the weight gain is happening more rampant all over the country, and that's why we are getting to see more and more of PCOS. And which is why, in turn, is leading to younger and younger patients getting endometrial cancer. The issue that was also brought out in this first abstract was comparison of minimally invasive surgery versus Yes, ma'am. I would quite agree. The next subsequent two papers, probably which deal only with endometrial cancer on a similar issue, will address this concern. So what I want to know from the panelists, all of whom are dealing with endometrial cancer patients in their practices, what proportion of your patients of endometrial cancer are undergoing a minimally invasive surgery, either a laparoscopic or a robotic? Because I can see that a number of you are working in government setups, and some of you are probably working in corporate setups. So I would like to ask Dr. Swapnil, I mean, you must be seeing endometrial cancer patients in your practice?
Yeah, I think about 40% of my patients of early endometrial cancers will undergo minimal invasive surgery in the form of laparoscopic surgery.
So your practice is the corporate hospital based?
Yeah, corporate and even nursing homes.
So, okay, so let's take the opinion of Dr. Shalini. She's working in a government hospital.
Yeah, would you include vaginal hysterectomy as minimally invasive?
Not really. I mean, for the time being, so we'll just be, I know.
Because we do a lot of vaginal hysterectomies for stage 1 endometrial cancers.
In fact,
and vaginally assisted laparoscopic hysterectomies where we remove the ovaries laparoscopically and do the rest of the surgery vaginally. And the main reason probably we're not taking longer to shift over to MIS is the load of patients that we have, and we have to finish maybe 6, 8, 9 cases in a period of 6 hours with 2 tables, and the numbers that are waiting for surgery. Laparoscopy definitely takes maybe 40, 50, 60 minutes more.
Certainly, that has been shown in the
so that's,
also.
Yeah.
Dr. Uma?
Yeah, the same thing I would like to say. Yes, we have not shifted over to MIS, frankly, but yes, the evidence says that it's a good method.
Dr. Umang, what's your personal practice on this?
Well, again, I'm one of those old cards. Still, around 20% of my patients I have shifted to MIS, and of course, for that, I normally take the help of my lab colleague, though I'm there with him, but I'm not so very well comfortable with that.
Okay.
I still believe that if I can do a job better in one way, I would go for that. Being an only oncology practice in a private center, sometimes having those numbers of a single specialty and to convince myself that I'm doing the right thing by doing laparoscopy sometimes makes a difference. But
Sure,
yes,
sure.
if when I'm in the corporate place in Fortis, I have my colleagues and I normally prefer to do an MIS.
Certainly. And Prashant?
I go the opposite.
Another mic, can we have?
It doesn't, the numbers are not so high. The only thing in the corporate setup which cost is the main problem. So MIS is around 10 to 20% because of the cost factor.
In other words, what we see from the panelists, which you all have seen, is that against what was presented in the abstract, that almost 50% patients went in for MIS in developed countries. The same is not really true for various reasons in our country. And at this point in time, the trend is changing. As I saw that the younger lot of the panelists are more into practice of minimally invasive surgery. Yes?
I would just like to intervene because coming from the same institute, I'm doing NCA endometrium laparoscopically, quite a few cases done. So probably it is more like who feels more comfortable.
Yes. I have no doubt, I mean, I've seen over the last 27, 28 years, the evolution in clinical practice or surgical practice amongst gynecologists. And there is no doubt that in the years to come, there will be more and more recourse to minimally invasive surgery that will be taken by more and more gynecologists and gynecologic oncologists. So at this point in time, yes?
We have been doing this for the past 10 years. It was 20-30% initially, now it is 100 out of 100%.
That's wonderful. It's
Since 6 years, I've never opened an endometrium.
Dr. Sangamaneshwar, that gives a huge amount of inspiration to those who are sitting on the fence, I'm sure they would, this is why I wanted to discuss what are the practice trends in our country, in our scenario. But when an input like that comes from you, that 100% of your early endometrial cases and cancer cases will go in for minimally invasive surgery, gives a huge amount of confidence to those who have been contemplating and have been generally shying away because they feel, like Dr. Umang said, that they feel that they can do a more thorough and a more complete job doing open surgery, and they feel a little less confident about doing the minimally invasive route. So I'm sure Dr. Umang will be inspired, and so will a lot of us.
I didn't say so exactly. I only said that I have not shifted. I
Sure.
didn't say so.
Fair.
And I said that, yes, it is a good modality.
Certainly. We have, the abstract itself has brought out that minimally invasive surgery is definitely almost as good as open surgery and has got lesser complications. And I'm sure most of us will be inspired to change over. I would like to ask Dr. Uma, in your practice, do you find obesity has a bearing on the overall cost and morbidity in endometrial cancer surgery patients?
About 10 years back in a similar meeting, I said that I saw a patient of about 90 kgs having endometrial cancer, and I felt that was a huge weight. And there were certain people, especially from Western countries, who said, that's nothing. So, the parameters about weight differ according to the kind of patients you see. And I'm sure those who are working in corporate hospitals see patients who are much more
obese, yes.
Obese. So probably that's the reason why in those heavyweight patients, definitely, the wound infections
Yeah.
and the feasibility of surgery by minimal invasive would be much better. There's no
Which is
doubt
what we
about
saw in
it.
the abstract also,
Yes,
that
there's no doubt
the
about it.
number of cases that underwent a complete lymphadenectomy in morbidly obese group were less than in the non-obese or less obese group.
And there is one thing more, at least in my practice, which has an overall bearing on the cost at least. If it is an obese patient, I would not operate it in any center. It would have to be a center with a very good ICU backup and a
Post-operative
lot of
care.
other things, and definitely the cost goes up. So in a smaller place, like I'm basically from Meerut, which is a smaller town, the cost is not so huge. But when I'm operating a patient who is obese, and I had last patient was 125 kgs, you have to have specific instruments.
Even the table has to
you
be
need to have a lot of things, and definitely you take a longer time. How you close the abdomen, you definitely use much more sutures and things like that, maybe interrupt it complete, and even then, the morbidity and a lot of other things, it increases the chances of infection. DVT rate is higher in these obese patients. The patients have more diabetes and hypertension, so you have a multimodal team who is treating the patient from day one, even from preoperative. Definitely the cost goes up, no doubt about that.
I would also like to ask the panelists.
Can
Yeah,
I
yeah,
just
sure.
talk about morbidity? Costs, of course, in government hospitals, it's nothing, so that's zero. We've reduced our morbidity in obese patients and all cancer patients. We use the Mayo Clinic closure pan. At the time of closure, we change our gloves, we change all the instruments, give a good wash, and then we close. So that has reduced one.
What wash?
It's give a wash, a saline wash,
Okay.
and then you close it. The Mayo Clinic follows some of these principles for reducing infection. Then we do give prophylactic anticoagulants like everybody else would give. Early mobilization, we use the DVT pumps during surgery, and also prophylactic antibiotics. So we have reduced our wound infection rates.
Yes, Dr. Swapnil, you wanted to add
I
something.
agree, ma'am, that infection is very less, but still it's more than the people who are, so that is the comparison.
One more point that I would like to add is in obese patients in whom we do open surgery, they have a higher incidence of developing post-operative basal atelectasis and pneumonia.
Certainly.
So that has not been mentioned,
Yeah.
and that takes antibiotics for a longer period. That may raise the cost, especially in a private setup. So that also we should consider, and that's one of the factors.
The chest physiotherapy also.
Yeah,
Yes, sure.
We start incentive spirometry
Incentive
from day
spirometry
one.
I think a good epidural, starting
epidural.
pre-op physiotherapy,
Yeah.
doing that. So I think the infection rate can still be decreased, but yes, your total cost increases because you are much
Epidural
more,
cost,
you are much more, you're doing a lot of efforts, having a good team to prevent these complications.
Right.
And I would say the mobility is not such a big issue. It is more the cost.
Cost, yes.
And maybe in open surgeries, the number of days the patient stays in the hospital, I would tend to keep the patient a wee bit longer
Right.
if it is an obese patient.
Right.
I want to know that do any of you, as a corollary, give advice to the patient about reducing weight?
Not
I mean,
in
either-
endometrial cancers, because we operate them
Yeah,
as soon as we diagnose.
Exactly.
So there is no
you
time
can't-
for you
no
to
time. You
tell the
cannot.
patient. But post-operative,
They will lose weight because of the surgery.
but in fact, advising them to lose weight may have a therapeutic value in reducing and improving their long-term prognosis.
For long-term prognosis, yes,
Yes.
definitely.
So
But for surgery,
most
you
of us
can't
do
have
our
that much
surgeries and we
time.
don't really actively talk about the importance of weight reduction. So since we were talking about high BMI and obesity, I thought it may be well worthwhile talking about the need to reduce weight. So as a take-home message, there is no denying the fact that obese patients would definitely be more challenging. Their morbidity in terms of wound infections, basal atelectasis after surgery, and venous thromboembolism incidence will be far more. And in case the circumstances and the resources permit, it would be a very, very good idea to shift them to MIS, which is associated with shorter hospital stays, lesser costs, and lesser complications. And Dr. Sangamneshwar has inspired all of us to move even more, fast track our change over to MIS. The second paper that was presented by Dr. Sampada was, does the type of surgical approach and the use of uterine manipulators influence the disease-free survival and recurrence rates in early-stage endometrial cancer? Now, this, I'm sure some of you would agree, is almost similar to the apprehension that a lot of people in 90s had about using hysteroscopy towards diagnosis in a patient suspected of endometrial cancer, whether that's going to lead to dissemination of cancer cells and things like that. And that was comprehensively discarded. That apprehension was comprehensively beaten. And we continue to do hysteroscopy with impunity. So this was the paper that has discussed two issues essentially: whether uterine manipulators are going to adversely affect the outcome of a patient of endometrial cancer by causing dissemination of cells, and also whether minimally invasive approach is good or not. So we've already discussed this because the papers were very similar. So we'll move on to this. I want to ask all of you who are doing laparoscopic hysterectomies that do you use uterine manipulators during laparoscopic hysterectomy? And if yes, is it yes from all of you, or is there anybody who's not using uterine manipulators during laparoscopic hysterectomy? I presume it's yes from everybody, because all of us inevitably use, though about 10 years ago, I was witness to Dr. Eric LeBlanc doing a radical laparoscopic hysterectomy in this very hospital, and I was sitting in this very auditorium and the workshop. During the workshop, he showed the performance of a type 3 radical laparoscopic radical hysterectomy, wherein he did not use any manipulators at all, and the surgery was duly accomplished. Yes, you? Even in endometrial cancers, you're not using? You're not using any?
We actually don't have a manipulator as a part of our
Is that the reason why you're not using?
Yeah, exactly.
Our manipulator is broken too, so we don't use a
Actually,
manipulator.
as I was developing into a minimal access surgeon since 1996, I bought 6 manipulators. I've spent some 4.5 lakhs on manipulators. All of them form a part of the museum in our hospital. We never use at all, and it is never necessary. We do an exenteration with a grasper of the horn of the uterus, and it is possible. It's only in your mind.
Yeah, I think...
When you get used to the tissue with a grasper on the horn, we do an anterior pelvic exenteration. I'll demonstrate it if it is.
Yeah, we've seen that video. So, yes, Dr. Nisha?
Design would be actually should not be comparing laparoscopic with laparotomy, but it should be with or without manipulators. If you want to answer this question, in the laparoscopic, like he does without and somebody does with, that's how.
Probably that would be the most ideal design. But even in this design, if you see, you have an approach which is using the manipulator and leading to what logically would appear to be a fertile ground for dissemination of cancer cells, versus an approach that does not do so. So that is the laparotomic approach. So which is why I think we can allow that to pass. So the second part is that those who are using manipulators, which ones are you using?
We use a dilator because we don't have a manipulator.
Okay. Yes, Swapnil?
We use a Vitoon's manipulator. It's like a long valsalum with a tip to it.
Okay.
So that's the one we use. After dilatation, we put
What about...
We have got a Clermont manipulator which has got a uterine this thing.
Okay.
And,
any problems with the uterine manipulators during surgery that you may have encountered, especially in cases of endometrial cancer where the...
I don't have experience of operating on endometrial
what we have seen is that
laparoscopy, so
there are times when you are doing the manipulation in a uterus which has got CA endometrium, which is infiltrating the myometrium, that perforation of the uterus during the performance of surgery does happen. So that is what I have seen. So we have already said that, would you use uterine manipulators during laparoscopic robotic surgery for endometrial cancer? Any concerns? Yes, yes. The opinion of the House, we've had one opinion from Dr. Sangneshwar that he will not use. Dr. Shailashri, you've been doing...
Extremely obese patients, very extremely obese. What I'm talking about extremely obese is 55 BMI.
55 BMI.
Yes, yes. And those were the regular patients in abroad. You can't see anything if you don't use the manipulator. The whole sigmoid is sitting there, the whole bladder fat is sitting there. I put a scope. So the general rule of thumb was if you could see the fundus of the uterus when I put a scope in, obviously with the manipulator, after I put the laparoscope in, you know you could complete the surgery. If I can't see anything in that big fat lady, it becomes difficult. Thin patients, I don't think it matters. Means thin, moderately okay patients, you can do anything you want. If once you are a good surgeon, you put a manipulator, don't put a manipulator, it doesn't matter. Extremely obese, sometimes we struggle. If I can't get
The
it.
question to Subramanieshwar, what is the proportion of extremely obese? Like we have 40 is the maximum, 38 to 40. What about in your practice? What is the highest BMI that you have operated on?
We have operated on 55, beyond 50 only twice. But 45 and all is common. 55 only twice.
So 45 is okay? 45 you don't need a manipulator then?
Both the times I didn't use the manipulator.
Okay.
Yeah, Dr. Amita, you
I'm
wanted to say something.
not used to manipulating things, so.
So robotic, I mean, I don't do laparoscopy, but I do robotics. So I routinely use actually, but as Dr. Subramanieshwar says, it's, I think, more in our minds, the way you have been trained. I think we can do it, but to put it that way, that so far we have not seen any extra incidence of vaginal recurrence if we have used manipulator. And it has been more than 2 years, so decent time has passed since the time I have started robotic, and we do use manipulator routinely. So we use the one Swapnil described. What is the name? I don't remember. Yeah, what?
Vitunes, yeah. So, will it be safe to conclude this abstract by saying that, once again, that minimally invasive surgery is safe and efficacious with less complications? And if you are using a uterine manipulator to facilitate your surgery, you could go ahead and do that without any apprehensions. But as some people from the floor have said, that it is possible to accomplish a complete surgery even without the manipulators, and we could consider experimenting with that for those who are not who are using the manipulators as of now.
I would just like to, put in a word. Would kind of putting a clip on infundibulopelvic decrease the dissemination before doing the surgery or anything like that?
In fact,
for those
in this
who are
paper,
using,
in this paper, they have coagulated the tubes before both tubes before embarking on the further aspects of surgery.
And also the infundibulopelvic. Just put a clip. Would that help? If there is an apprehension, if the studies have shown there is no risk of there, then there is no problem about it. But I don't know.
In one of the study, they have shown pre-manipulation and post-manipulation, no fluid cytology shows malignancy.
Yes, that's right. So I think
the thing is, this is early endometrial cancer. I don't know what about the advanced stage where bulky disease and other things.
See, it's very difficult to prove or disprove that something increases the vaginal relapse or not. But it is aesthetically, oncologically, it doesn't look good. So if you can avoid it, you avoid it. The biggest advantage, especially in such obese patients, is you will not lose a surgeon in the perineum. One of them is sitting there, and ergonomically, if you have one monitor, we have 3 monitors, so we are comfortable. All the time hoping that the senior will complete the surgery sometime during the day. So he is only praying that you will complete. So this discomfort is something significant, because I have gone through all that when I was a junior. So.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to the next abstract, and that once again also talks about the disease-free survival and overall survival after TLH versus open abdominal hysterectomy for early-stage endometrial cancer. These are the long-term results from the LACE trial. And I think we have already talked about that the results of MIS and open surgery are almost comparable. And we have also agreed that we should, if possible, we should adopt MIS in endometrial cancers like Dr. Subramanieshwar. Can we talk about this, that why MIS is not widely being used to treat early stage endometrial cancer in our country, besides the reasons of time that Dr. Shalini Rajaram said? Is there any other reason which we can talk about openly? Yeah, cost.
The cost, I suppose.
I suppose the number of places where endometrial cancer presents and the number of places where facilities available, there's a huge inequity in that. There's a huge inequity. And after all, the healthcare inequity in our country is enormous, humongous, to use your word.
And we can't say that endometrial cancer in our country is only affecting very affluent class women. It is definitely in the middle and the lower middle
Yes,
class
it is.
also.
Because all that it is being affected by is calorie sufficiency.
Yes.
It's
So it is
only
not
calorie sufficiency, which is there in the lower middle and the middle socioeconomic strata as well.
Can I just give one example? About
Yes.
2 years back, we embarked on a study in which we wanted to recruit 20 endometrial cancer cases for sentinel node evaluation. And in the first 6 months, we could get only about 6 of them, so we had to abandon this. It was a PG thesis. And 2 years later, I've again given a thesis on endometrial cancer, and we've already accrued 40.
Okay.
So in 2 years, we've jumped from 6 in 6 months to 40 in 1 year. So that's the magnitude of the problem.
We'll quickly move on to the two papers which pertain to the MMR defects, and that should, galvanize Dr. Jamie Pratt and Dr. Santosh Menon into action. So the first paper is Clinicopathological Significance of Mismatch Repair Defects in Endometrial Cancer, as presented by Dr. Monisha. So I would like, Dr. Jamie Pratt has already made a mention of what mismatch repair defects are. Frankly speaking, I'm sure a lot of practicing gynae oncologists in the audience will not have a very clear idea as to what MMR defects are and what is their significance in terms of the nature and outcome of endometrial cancers. So would you just like to tell us?
Yeah, I already, I think I pointed out that microsatellite instability results from lack of repair, in the setting of either inherited, abnormal, mutation, germline mutations in the mismatch repair genes, or in the sporadic cases, is a result of, the genes are perfect, but the sequence before the gene that is called is hypermethylated. So let me make it clear. I said that every time the cell gets into the cycle, there are errors. These errors are taken care of by the repair system, which is really the one to blame for. And in that case, you have, if they are mutated because of mutations in the germline, you have the Lynch syndrome, right? Which is more common in the colon than in the endometrium. But whereas in most cases, sporadic cases, there is no such a thing as germline mutation. The genes are intact, but they cannot talk because the precursor, that word doesn't come to me now, is hypermethylated. The sequence before the gene is hypermethylated, so the gene cannot express. And that could be mild or severe. No, the higher the hypermethylation, the more the hypermethylation, the less the gene can express. And we study that by investigating promoter hypermethylation. Okay. Now, your question was, what is the impact on the biological course of the disease? And that has always been controversial. Because some people say, oh, if you have microsatellite instability, we heard this morning, it's much better than if you don't, if they are
In other words, what you mean to say is that in probably colorectal centers, their association with the outcome is better defined, whereas in endometrial cancer, it's not so clearly defined.
Well, now I have this combination of microsatellite instability and the Wnt and beta-catenin, the CTNNB1 mutation, that apparently, makes the prognosis much worse. And I'm referring to type 3. Remember I said ultra-mutated, hyper-mutated, low copy number. Low copy number, and then, of course, the high copy number is bad news. But the low copy number, if you have microsatellite instability and CTNNB1 mutation, which is beta-catenin, the protein is beta-catenin, the gene is CTNNB1, that is bad news.
Dr. Santosh, I would like to ask you that whether these mismatch repair defects, they are only inherited or they can be acquired also?
They are acquired, like Sarah said. Basically, there are germline ones which are inherited, And then you have something like hypermethylated, which occurs in the somatic tissue. So those are acquired kind of mutations within the tumor tissue, actually.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So you can have these MMR defects, the defects in repairing all those errors that happen at the time of replication, which can be genetic or it can be an acquired somatic defect. Would you also like to tell us that how are these MMR defects? I mean, what is their correlation with colorectal cancers?
So like most of the MMR colorectal cancers are right-sided cancers, and they have a lot of tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes. And if you look at clinical outcome of MMR defective, which are MMR positive tumors, MSI high tumors in colorectal, they do better because of tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes. They control the disease. That's what one of the. The other thing is because they have defects in the repair, they affect a lot of the genome. A lot of the genomic activity is affected and is defective. And because the tumor also gets defective genes, the tumor also has a lot of effect, and there is a tendency for the tumor to die itself. Yep. And the other thing is, in MMR defective colorectal cancers, if there's node negative colorectal cancers, giving chemotherapy might be detrimental actually in these cases. So it's very important colorectal to gauge the MMR defect in all colorectal cancers, say below 40 years, which are right-sided. So we routinely do MSI testing, MMR IHCs in these cases.
Okay. We just, would you like to give us what should be the take-home message from this paper, Dr. Santosh, that as we have heard from Dr. Monisha, that there is only about 62% patients of this study had a normal MMR, and the remaining had some kind of a defect or the other. So she also brought out that the patients with MMR defects had higher grade disease, higher stage disease, increased incidence of LVSI, but as a contradiction, no adverse effect on the PFS or the overall survival. So that's something that's really interesting, that though the disease tends to be higher stage, higher grade, and other adverse factors are present, but the overall survival. And once again, I think the role of some altered immunity and immune surveillance.
These cases have a very undifferentiated morphology, and they can also have undifferentiated endometrioid cancer alongside a very low grade kind of grade 1 kind of cancer. When you see this kind of morphology, we would do IHC testing on these cases. Okay. And they have a lot of tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes. So that's one thing.
Sure. Probably the next paper has when should you do it? No?
Yeah, so in the next paper, which was pertaining to Lynch syndrome, what I would like to ask Dr. Shalini is that as far as that paper is concerned, how many patients of endometrial cancer below 60 were found to have positive testing for Lynch syndrome?
I think 1 in 5.
1 in 5. 20%. So that means endometrial cancer happening below 60 years of age, 1 in 5 of them, which is a very large number, are going to have test positive for Lynch syndrome. What do you think will be the significance of this positive testing on them and their family members?
Yeah, I think the two things, you'll get to know whether it's inherited or it's somatic. Somatic, you don't test the family members, but inherited, you have to test the family members because they have high incidence of not only endometrial, but colon, ovary, other GI malignancies are there. So suppose you have endometrial cancer which has presented itself first, then they need and they're positive also for Lynch syndrome, then they would need yearly colonoscopies and other preventive work.
So in other words, if we were to summarize this whole thing, that if you have endometrial cancers occurring below 60, there may be a case, in case facilities are available, to screen them for Lynch syndrome. As she brought out, it's a two-step screening. You don't have to screen everybody for the gene studies. You can do a two-step diagnostic procedure. And in case there is positive Lynch syndrome, then the family, genetic counseling should be done. Yes?
Go for screening. Because if you have one cancer in the multiple cancers, you have the 30% chances at 10 years and 50%
exactly.
Yes. So if you have one cancer, as Dr. Dilip Nikam has brought out, that there is a significant chance of developing the second cancer in the years to come.
And with the life expectancy increased, if they are found
and Dr. Santosh and Dr. Jamie, it's easy to do MSI and MSH, mismatch repair testing on IHC.
Yeah, it's
so that should not be very difficult to do it and then advise. I said it's easy to do IHC markers and MLH1 methylation studies on tumor tissue. It's quite easy to do it. So why should we shy away from doing it in patients?
To begin with, we can do MSI IHC very routinely because it's already been done in colorectal. Currently in endometrium, we are picking and choosing based on the lower uterine presentation of the and undifferentiated morphology, tumor infiltrating lymphocytes, those kind of things we are.
But I think following this thing that less than 50 years or less than 60 years.
This can be easily adopted in our setup.
Yeah. I think if possible, it can be adopted. The last paper was vaginal brachytherapy versus EBRT in high intermediate risk. We'll have the last word from Dr. Dilip Nikam since we are running out of time. So last word from you that based on this paper, what would be your conclusions? And if there are recent studies which have contributed to this?
We in radiation oncology faculty, we consider this as a landmark trial, okay, which published in 2010. The whole basis was the patient subset, which was we considered as a high intermediate risk. That is very limited set of patients based on the PORTEC 1 trial, where the age more than 60 years, grade more than grade 3 tumor, or infiltration more than 50%. Any two out of these three, they termed it as a high intermediate risk. And the whole basis was to go ahead with the external beam radiotherapy versus vaginal brachytherapy. And the vaginal brachytherapy, the conclusion of this trial is equivalent in reducing the locoregional recurrences with the significant reduction in the intestinal toxicity or associated toxicity. So it can be considered that as a effective alternative for the external beam radiotherapy, but the patient selection has to be very careful.
The high intermediate risk group.
High intermediate risk group. There is very good guidelines published by the ESMO, and I routinely follow these ESMO guidelines, which I find very simple and easy and helpful to decide and stratify your patient into the low, intermediate, high, advanced, and the metastatic.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dilip Nikam, and thank you so much all the panelists sitting here on the dais. I'm sorry for exceeding